Look, this one is intense. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome or welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for spending some time with me. Today I have a review for you of You Weren't Meant to Be Human by Andrew Joseph White. This is being published by Saga Press on September 9th, 2025, and I was given a complimentary copy in exchange for an honest review. But I have to say, I already pre-ordered a hardcover as soon as I got, halfway through the book. That is how much I love this book. I have read all of Andrew Joseph White's young adult fiction, and I love them. I read them more than once, and so I was really looking forward to his adult fiction debut or his novel debut. I've read some short stories that kind of clued me in as to what his adult fiction might be like, but this is his first full-length novel that is aimed at adults, not at young adults, and it lived up to my expectations, but it was also quite brutal. What is the story about? The story, it follows a young trans man named Crane, and he's also autistic, and it takes place in the near future, like a recognizable future. And the one thing that is unrecognizable is there is what we can call the swarm, which is this heaping pile, this pulsating mess of insects and worms and so forth, like this gross, disgusting, non-human entity. Yet this entity, it creates community. It accepts all of the broken people that live on the margins of society, and it gives them a home, right? And so the swarm has different hives, and you belong to a hive. And once you belong to that hive, you look at that hive as having saved you, and you'll do anything for it, right? And so Crane is dedicated to this one particular hive. Now, when you are dedicated to a hive, you have to do whatever the hive wants, including feeding that hive, which includes getting bodies to feed that hive, human bodies, sometimes. So it isn't like an easy existence, right? But at least you feel like you have a home. And that is the future or the world that we're in. And now the heart of the story is that Crane gets pregnant, and he didn't think he was able to, but he does. And he wants to get rid of the baby because it's intensifying his dysphoria. But the swarm or the hive decides that it doesn't want him to get rid of the baby. It wants him to carry the baby to term because it wants the baby. And that is the whole novel. There isn't a whole lot of plot beyond that. And Crane, you find out he has decided not to speak. He's capable of speech, but he made a decision not to speak. And you find out why as the story continues. But so the whole story is told from his point of view. And communication is like a big part of the story, and an inability to find the means to express what he's feeling in a way that is actually heard by the people around him. And the reason, or one of the reasons he chooses not to speak, and I'm not giving anything away, but you can imagine that he struggles with communication, and he chooses not to speak to some extent because he didn't find that was helping his struggles, right? So communication is a big thing. Now, before I kind of explain more of my thoughts about the writing and everything, I think it's worthwhile to read the author's note that precedes the book. Now, of course, I'm reading an advanced reader copy, so this might change, but this is the author's note / trigger warning that comes at the beginning of the book. Andrew Joseph White says, "In addition to a graphic focus on pregnancy, miscarriage, abortion, and childbirth, You Weren't Meant to Be Human contains depictions of suicidal ideation, self-harm, violence, sex, and abuse, sometimes alone, sometimes combined, sometimes indistinguishable one from another." And I have to say, there is a scene very early in this novel, in the early pages, that it isn't particularly graphic, but the emotional weight is so heavy that I had to put the book down to remind myself to breathe. This book is unapologetic and it is brutal, but it never for a moment feels exploitative or like it is pushing boundaries just for the sake of doing that. As you get lost in this story, you get the clear sensation that if there was any other way to tell this story, then Andrew Joseph White would. But this is the only way. There is no other way to get this across. This actually makes the story more visceral, more claustrophobic, more intimate, because there is a truth here in this story. And it is painful, and it is dirty, and it is violent, and yet it is undeniable. Reading Andrew Joseph White's young adult novels forced me to really reconsider what the term young adult means as a marketing category and what could be contained in a young adult novel. And here, he defiantly displays that the horror and the violence and the dysregulation that he depicts in his young adult novels is in fact quite tame compared to the emotional devastation that he is capable of in his writing. Now, I think Andrew Joseph White's characters are great as usual. The ancillary characters are all really well described, and they're experienced from the perspective of the main character, and so none of them are as fleshed out as he is, but they still feel like genuine people. And given the story and the setting, They all make sense in this environment, and I can picture them. I can recognize them. The main character, Crane, is incredible. So much of his life is an enigma, even to himself, but there is an emotional honesty to this character, and it is sometimes painful to witness. It's often painful to witness. He is complicated and he's committed, and I loved every broken part of him. Everything about this situation, the desperation, the loneliness, the isolation, they all add up to this subtle but impressive world building. And what I think I appreciated the most is the lack of detail about the swarm, about the hives. So the swarm is the overall alien entity, and the hives are the individual instances of it, right? Local instances. So you might go visit another hive in a nearby town and so forth. And there's nothing but ambiguity about this. You aren't given really any explanation. You're given some possible explanations for where it came from, but there's nothing definitive. And how it is able to, get into your mind and convince you to join it and give up everything else in your life is never really explained. You just kind of are given it. Like any good sci-fi, it just kind of tells you this is the world, so deal with it, right? It doesn't bother with all this exposition, giving you backstory, giving you reasoning, because this is something alien that you can't reason with, right? So it doesn't try to explain all that away. But what I love about it is it's incredibly ambiguous. There's a version of this story where you find out that the swarm is really a metaphor for the many buzzing faces of a crime syndicate that exploits marginalized and downtrodden people, and nothing about the story has to change. There's another version of this story where the swarm is really just the status quo, the allure of a performative cishet normativity that can convince us to act against our best interest. And in exchange for things feeling easier at times, at least on the surface, we choose to give up the most crucial parts of ourselves, right? The swarm can be a metaphor for both of those things, and nothing about the story has to change. Now, I choose to believe that the swarm is this literal alien or non-human thing, right? This entity that is overtaking the world slowly, small town by small town. But it doesn't have to be, right? That is the beauty of this story, is that there is this ambiguity, and where you choose to go with it and the different layers to the metaphor are all really exciting and interesting to dig into, because it gives you just enough to get your brain itching, but it doesn't create any walls or boundaries to stop you from having theories and ideas about what he's really trying to get at and what else could apply to the story that he's telling. So I'm impressed by the ambiguity, because the swarm itself is a disease. It feasts on our hopes and our dreams, and it infects us, and it offers us chains, but it calls them mercy. The writing in this novel feels deeply personal. It pulls the reader in and it makes you complicit, holding a hand over your mouth, not just to muffle your screams, but because sometimes the world is easier to deal with when everything starts to go gray around the edges. In all of that, there is a poetry to it, a sense of direction and a confidence in the prose itself that convinces the reader that the story is going in the exact direction that it needs to, and it is heading towards its only possible outcome. The pacing is smart, and it builds in intensity as the due date of our main character approaches. The sections are marked off by distinguishing how close we are to the impending birth of this child. And the story is this comfortable balance of action and silence. The story is so isolated and it is so claustrophobic that there isn't really a lot of narrative action, actually, but there's always the sense of movement, a sense of inevitability. And this highlights the uniquely internal journey that is the messy heart of this novel and of our main character. And the story, it didn't end at all the way I expected it to, but as I turned the last page, it was clear that it was what it had to be in all of its vile glory. And I haven't had such a confusing, competing set of simultaneous emotions in a long time. And the juxtaposition of this gloomy cloud cover and piercing snowblind brilliance was pitch perfect. It really was. It took my breath away and kicked me in the gut at the same time. It was incredible, the emotional journey that you go on in this story, both in terms of an apex and a nadir, and where you end up, and the kind of violence, not just physical violence, but also emotional violence, violence to oneself and violence to others, that is necessary in order for the transformation that our character is seeking. It is painful, right, at times, really hard to read at times, but it also is amazingly life-affirming, even as it is destructive at the same time. The story, it's about a lot of things, right? Knowing yourself, knowing your worth and your value, that's one of them. But being able to discover that and to affirm it when it feels like the whole world is against you, that is another one. And there is an uncompromising compassion for that struggle to understand yourself. This novel also has ideas of power and control, identity, presentation, protection, comfort, acceptance, support, they all have a role to play in this story, in this journey. Yet nothing about this story feels like it is force feeding you anything, like it is sermonizing or lecturing. It just feels like there is this unflinching dignity that underlies this story. And for all of the themes or ideas that the novel is playing with, it's this dignity that stands on its own and it represents nothing but itself. And so this story might turn your stomach, but it won't let you look away. I think that's all I have to say. I loved this story. I was moved by it. I gasped out loud. I had to put the book down at times. I was impressed, page after page after page. Everything about it, I think, was a home run, and it just makes me more excited to continue reading Andrew Joseph White's work. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have any of you had a chance to read this? Are you excited for his adult fiction debut? What do you think of his young adult titles? And any other thoughts down in the comments below. Let's have a conversation. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves. Take care of each other and go slowly.